All right, hi everybody. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the first readings that you have, the medieval women's visionary literature. So we moved into the medieval period last time, and we're looking at that kind of from a perspective of spirituality this week. You read short excerpts from Hildegard, from Marie Douanier, and from Gertrude the Great. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit, contextualize what's going on with female spirituality in the Middle Ages, and then talk briefly about each of these women so that we can be prepared for our discussion on Wednesday. So the 12th and the 13th century in Europe is often talked about as the time of flowering of medieval culture. There was an increase in population. So from the year 1000 up to the year 1300 to 1325, there was a pretty dramatic increase in population. In the first third of the 14th century, that population dipped again because of the plague. And about 1/3 of the population of Europe died in the bubonic plague. But between 1000 and about 1320s, which is what the time that we're talking about, was an increase in population, and society was becoming more and more complex. We know that there were increasing literacy rates for people who were not in the church. So for your average person, there was more of a chance of literacy. There was a growth of the aristocracy and the urban middle class. So that means when there's a increase in wealthy people, or at least middle class people, then those people want entertainment. So there's a growth of vernacular literature, songs, poetry. So it's sort of this artistic flowering all over the place. And so basically during that part of the High Middle Ages, especially the 12th and 13th centuries, society is becoming more and more complex. There were also many religious changes and developments during these centuries, and the women that we're reading for today are part of that. So before the 11th century or so, living as a Christian really meant living in the monastery, living out the Christian life. If you really were called to live out the Christian life, you would do that within a monastic setting. As we talked about, these monastic people were kind of the professional religious people of the day, and they kind of took on the role of taking care of religion for the people. This is prior to the 11th century, certainly the 10th century. But from the 11th century, and especially into the 12th and 13th century, there's a rereading of the apostolic life and what it means to follow Jesus. And it is reimagined by some as an active life of poverty and preaching and wandering around, especially for men. And so new forms of piety are introduced. And these are known as the mendicant orders. Dominicans and the Franciscans are especially successful. These are people who are devoted to religious life, devoted to being followers of Jesus, and are not living in traditional monastic settings. So there's and then in a lot of these people, and they weren't all Dominicans or Franciscans. Sometimes people just sort of banded together with a group and would travel and perform acts of charity and preach. And so there's a revival of vernacular preaching, or there's sort of a development of vernacular preaching. People were consumed by religious concerns, would come into your town and start to exhort and talk about Jesus and talk about what it means to be a Christian. In fact, St. Norbert in some ways was part of this movement, right? St. Norbert had a conversion experience, and then he had just been sort of like a wealthy young man who had inherited his religious position. And then he underwent a transformation spiritually and began preaching, and he founded monastic orders, but in some ways he's part of this. So that growth of the vernacular preaching, these new ways of being a Christian, mendicant orders, these were also, of course, attractive to women. And so some of these new religious orders, and even the older religious orders, the Benedictines, were undergoing reform movements, changing and kind of reassessing who they were, and a huge increase in the number of women's monasteries we see during the 12th and 13th centuries. Women were also, of course, called in great numbers to this kind of religious life, but they weren't able necessarily, as I mentioned last time, to wander around for the reasons we talked about, even with regard to the Eremitic monasticism. It's not safe for women to wander around. It's threatening to society. Women who are not sort of tied to a particular place in a particular community are seen as threatening. So the Dominicans and the Franciscans both formed second orders for women, but they had to live in an enclosed form. So last year when I was in Assisi, I was able to see, all of the sites where Francis had grown up, the streets he walked, the places where his ministry started, and then also where Clare began her order in the Church of San Damiano enclosed, right? Clare and her sisters could not go out and wander from village to village in Italy the way that Francis and his group could. So there grows to be some conflict over women's role during this period. Women are very interested in the religious life. They're not always welcome. The Cistercians, who are a very strict order developed from Benedictine monasticism, they thought that women were constitutionally unable to obey strict rules, that they were too weak, too flighty for the rigors of the monastic life. There were, if you read monastic literature from the time, there were many, many monks who felt that women are dangerous to male well-being. There was extreme sexism during this time. One early Norbertine wrote of women that the poisons of vipers and dragons are healthier and less harmful for men than familiarity with women. And often these discussions took place over whether there should be dual monasteries and there were many, where women lived on one side and men lived on the other side. Some, of course, thought this was a good idea. Others felt that this was a dangerous idea, and mainly that not that men were dangerous to women, but that women were dangerous to men. Women were dangerous to male piety. Women had to be, had to be kept under control. And here's where the issue of authority comes in. And I mentioned last time, I want you to, as you read these texts by these three very different women, to think about the issue of authority. Men have authority in a patriarchal society just by virtue of being men. And in the medieval period and in the church, men also have clerical authority. Since women can't be ordained, all sacraments must be administered by men. Men have, as the universities are developed at Oxford and Paris and the great universities which are coming into existence in the Middle Ages, those forms of authority, the authority of the learned theologian and the learned person, that's also an authority only available to women. Only available to men and completely excluded to women, right? So women couldn't attend university. Women cannot be priests. They can't be clerics. They can't perform sacraments. And if you imagine a world in which religion is everything, right? There aren't any other real interests in the world in medieval Europe that could ever compare with the interest in Christianity. And yet all of the access to preaching, knowledge, and status within this system are denied to women, except for one. And that's where we get this spiritualism and mysticism, because they could be excluded from ordination, they could be excluded from avenues of power, they could be excluded from the universities, but they could not be excluded from visionary experiences. If Jesus or Mary or the saints want to illuminate somebody's heart or appear in a vision, they will do so. And there's nothing that any male figure can stop. And so women tend to be extraordinarily in tune with this visionary dimension of Christianity during this time. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about another alternative movement that was taking place in some parts of Europe during this era that Marie Douanier is part of. And this is the Beguine movement, Beguine, Beguines. Beguines were groups of women, lay women, who began living together in urban settings. They would sort of take over a neighborhood, live close to each other, live communally. And they were striving for lives of piety and charity, but they were not committed to to any rule, and they did not enter into a monastic life, which includes a period of formation, of taking of vows. The Beguines banded together by mutual consent to live according to their understanding of what Christ would want. So sort of voluntary organizations. They did much in the places where they were tolerated. They were tolerated because of the work that they did, right? So they did many great acts of charity, ministering to the sick, ministering to the poor. But they also were known for very distinctive forms of piety. They had they weren't just charitable organizations. They had a very intense focus on prayer, poverty, chastity, and visionary experiences. And many Beguine women experienced ecstatic visions, even erotic visionary experiences of Christ. And so they were sort of a very, I hesitate to use the word fanatical, but they were an attractive option for very devout women who didn't want a traditional life of being a homemaker, housekeeper, but wanted to live in community. As I also mentioned last time when we were talking about monasticism, many of these great houses, these great orders, these great abbeys, your average person wasn't going to be allowed into them. Many Beguines were widows or women who had otherwise no longer had access to family ties in the way that they may have at another point in their life. And so they banded together with other women. The Beguines were appreciated in some communities for their charitable work. They were attractive, and to people seeking out these sort of intense forms of spirituality, but they also came to be seen as very threatening, and they were often persecuted by church authorities. Why would women living together to pray and do good works be threatening? Well, they were not enclosed, right? If you're living in a monastic community as a woman, there are boundaries around you, quite literally. You can't just go do whatever you want. You have to obey the abbess. You have to obey the rule. You have a male confessor who sort of, and so the community is strictly controlled. But a Beguine community has none of this. They're not enclosed within a monastic setting. They, at times, are claiming their own authority to speak about Christ and God as women and devising their own rules. And so Beguines could be very threatening to the hierarchy, both socially and theologically. They were intensely, as I said, intensely spiritual. And that spirituality, that mystical spirituality, tended toward, at times, two problematic ways of thinking, at least according to the authorities who challenged them. Number one is autotheism, meaning the self becomes indistinguishable from God. Beguines who, as I'm thinking of Marguerite Porete, who was a famous Beguine, she talked about becoming one with God, to the point where there was no distinction between her and God, or so the authorities felt. But some Beguines also experienced such intense spiritual kind of unity with God, or that they wrote about, that they were also accused of antinomianism, which means being beyond the law, being beyond rules. So where did the self end and God start? Church hierarchy was very keen to make those limits known, and as women were seen as more profoundly sinful than men in most cases, there was a real desire to keep women under control. Beguines challenged that. Marie Douanier, who we read, was a Beguine, and her story is written by Jacques de Vitry. And you might remember Jacques de Vitry. He was a priest who was very supportive of Beguines. He was also the person who wrote down some of those legends of Mary that we read last time. Jacques de Vitry was a supporter of Beguines, felt that Marie was extraordinarily pious, and wanted to protect her and make sure that her story was known. So Marie died in 1213. So she's living mostly in the 10th century into the early 11th century. She was born into the upper classes and in France, her village in France, and she was very inclined towards religion as a child, very pious. She got married against her wishes. Her parents married her off when she was a young girl, but she somehow, her piety impressed her husband, and she convinced him that that her way of life was right, and that the two of them should live a celibate life as brother and sister. So he supported her as well in her chosen life. So together, Marie and her husband turned their luxurious home that they had gotten as a wedding gift into a home for lepers. This was kind of a shocking move to her family. She, as you know from your reading, she was very well known, as were many women in this era, for austere penitential practices. She was famous for not eating. You read this very disturbing story. She couldn't keep down anything except the Eucharist, et cetera, et cetera. So I want, eventually what happens to Marie is that she leaves her husband with permission from her confessor to live alone in isolation. And she eventually dies from her extreme austere practices. So I want you to think about this story. In the story that you read, there are competing forms of authority, right? There's Marie, who can't stop crying, and there's this priest who tries to silence her. And we're going to spend some time trying to pull that apart. What's going on there, right? Again, we're not interested in the truth, the facts, but we're interested in this story and what it reveals about negotiation of authority and power, especially with regard to devoutly spiritual women like Marie and the church hierarchy they were both dependent on yet excluded from. Okay, so I want you to think about that. Marie and other women, many women, including the great doctor of the church, Catherine of Siena, but many others, had to use their bodies as ways to assert authority. And Catherine of Siena also died in her 30s of starvation, self-induced starvation. And so I want us to spend some time thinking about that phenomenon and see if it is something that makes sense to us today. Why does anorexia and self-harm affect women so much more than men? What are women and young girls attempting to accomplish by denying their bodies food, nourishment, by harming themselves? I'm not saying that it's an exact parallel, but I think that this is a fruitful place for discussion. So that's Marie. She's an example of extraordinary penitential practices leading to her early death. And she's also a member of the Beguine movement, a really important movement of women's spirituality. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about Hildegard. We could have an entire semester, we could have an entire year talking about Hildegard. Hildegard she died in 1179, 1098 to 1179. So she's just a little earlier than Marie. She was the 10th child born into a noble German family. And as I mentioned last time, people with a lot of children and a lot of wealth would oftentimes consecrate or offer one of their children to the monastery early on. And so she became enclosed in a monastery at age 8. She experienced visions from a very early age. She was a sickly child, I think around 3. At age 3, she started experiencing visions. She lived in the abbey from the age of 8. She had a nun that was sort of served as her mother figure. And she was, I think by her late 20s, elected abbess. Hildegard was a genius. She was a genius of just across the board, right? So she was a composer. Not only did she compose music, she invented a new notation system for music. She was a visionary, so she wrote about her visions, and that's a little bit of what we read for this time. She was a biblical exegete, so she read scripture and interpreted scripture. She was a naturalist, so she was a scientist who documented and cataloged plants, animals. She had a taxonomy for those things. She was a doctor. She was a healer. She was an administrator. She invented some sort of an indoor plumbing system to be used in monasteries. She was a playwright. She was a visual artist. So there really isn't a realm of human, sort of endeavor that she didn't excel in. So, I hesitate to call Hildegard like a brilliant woman of the Middle Ages. She's just a brilliant person across the board. She was extremely powerful and learned woman. She corresponded with popes, abbots, emperors. The most powerful men of the day looked to her for advice and would travel to her monastery to meet with her, or would write to her so that they could get her advice on ethical and administrative matters. So we're going to look a little bit about her, the kinds of authority that she's asserting in this book of her visions, the Scivias. How does she understand herself? And, you know, here's this woman who, unlike Marie, has access to a great deal of power. She's probably one of the most powerful women of the medieval period. But how does she talk about that power? How does she, what avenues does she use to express it? So we're going to talk about that too. But I encourage you to look into Hildegard if you haven't. She's a little bit been co-opted lately by some New Age writers, and you know, she's one of these people who is attractive to our day, but she was a thoroughly medieval woman, and you know, I think it's important to read her within her own context and not try to make her into some sort of modern person. She was not a modern person. She was a medieval woman, and within that context, I think she's extremely important to know about and think about. The last person that we're going to talk about is Gertrude the Great. She's the latest. She died in 1298. She entered the monastery, Benedictine monastery, at age 5. And she began seeing visions in her 20s that lasted until her death. She had an extraordinary devotion to Christ and his heart. In one vision, Christ physically came to her and asked her to place her head on his chest so he could hear her heartbeat, or she could hear his heartbeat. So this physicality is what's important about Gertrude. And we kind of recoil from the idea of physical relationship with the divine today. I would say that we're squeamish in ways that the medieval people were not. Medieval people were far more creative in their theology than people today. Medieval people talked about Jesus in feminine terms. They talked about Jesus as a nursing mother, right? They were able to imagine and conceive of visual, poetic, artistic metaphors for religious life that we are extraordinarily squeamish about. And those go to metaphors of breastfeeding, of blood, of body, and even metaphors of sexuality. The idea of sexual union being the ultimate kind of loss of self and entering into a loving union with another was not off limits to be taught for language for God in the Middle Ages. And it's off limits for us, right? And that is because we are less creative and less open-minded than medieval people. That's just simply a fact. So I'm looking forward to taking that issue up with you and elaborating more on it when we meet in a couple days. I'm going to talk briefly about the Crusades as well. I'm not sure, in my experience, these visionary texts people like to talk about them. So we'll see how far we get, but I'm definitely going to also talk about the Crusades. I'm going to pause this. You can pause now too. And the second half of the lecture will be about the Crusades. All right, so we're going to talk about the First Crusade, which took place between 1095 and 1099. I'm also going to put up a video clip about the First Crusade that you can watch. Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095 at the proclamation at Clermont. I believe you've got this in your reading. Let me see. So at the proclamation at Clermont, Urban II says, "From the confines of Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople, a horrible tale has gone forth and very frequently has been brought to our ears, namely that a race from the kingdom of the Persians, an accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, a generation, forsooth, which has neither directed its heart nor entrusted its spirit to God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by sword, pillage, and fire." He's talking about Muslims. Islam had begun with the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century in what is now Saudi Arabia, so in the 800s. The Abrahamic faith, with Muhammad as the final prophet of God, is monotheistic and iconoclastic. If you think about how attractive Islam would be to people who were still arguing about Christology, um, it Islam offers a straightforward monotheism without Trinitarianism. God is one. That is the main tenet of Islam. Jesus is a great prophet of God. So is Muhammad. Islam is also iconoclastic. So those were also arguments between the East and West. To what degree are images allowed? Do images lead to idolatry in Islam? The answer is unequivocally yes. Human beings are easily distracted by images, and we fall into worship of images. There should be no images of God, of Jesus, of the prophets whatsoever, because we can't handle it. We fall into worship of these things. Like Christianity, Islam inspires both spiritual and military dedication to God. So Islam inspired people to fight for it, right? And to conquer in the name of it, just as Christianity did, right? So we've got these two. Islam is rapidly becoming a great world religion in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, and we've got Christianity also ascending, becoming more powerful, becoming more militaristic, and these two religions are going to come into a clash. So by the 9th century, Islam had spread dramatically. It caught on very quickly and became dominant in North Africa, Spain, and the eastern parts of the Mediterranean. And so at that time in Western Christendom, right, so Islam is a big threat in the East. What's happening in the West is that the Pope is getting more and more powerful, temporally speaking. So the Pope is amassing more wealth, more power, more military might, right? The Pope is not just a kind of a wealthy bishop, as you could have described the Pope in the earlier centuries. The Pope is becoming the main powerful monarch of Western Christendom. Population is increasing. There's also increasing interest in pilgrimage, right? And we talked briefly about pilgrimage last time. As these ways of, as your average everyday person wants to experience, isn't content necessarily with outsourcing religious faith, but wants intense religious experiences of their own, pilgrimage becomes a real option for that. And so there's an increased interest in pilgrimage, travel, trade routes. Muslims, Christians, and Jews begin to exchange ideas, to trade goods, to exchange ideas, but they also come into conflict, particularly over holy sites. Right? So we care about sacred space. Human beings care about spaces, right? We can see ourselves here in the United States coming into conflict over monuments, over who gets to own a space, claim its meaning, right? Is this monument something that ought to stand forever, or is it now going to take on a new meaning or be removed? And we get heated about those things, right? And we get heated about those things when they come to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but we really get heated about those things when we're talking about God and space that God has somehow given to one group, or that God has somehow designated as particularly important to one group. And as Muslims, Christians, and Jews begin to increase in number, they come into conflict over holy sites, in particular Jerusalem. So I'm still talking about the Crusades. Jerusalem is, of course, significant for Christians, right? It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection, and it's a model for understanding heaven, right? So Jerusalem isn't just a memorial site where all kinds of important things happened in the life of Jesus. It's also the heavenly Jerusalem in the Middle Ages is understood as a model for heaven. So it's a divine cosmology that is reflected in Jerusalem. I think oftentimes people think that Jerusalem is just like an important place where things happened, but in the Middle Ages, Jerusalem is the heavenly Jerusalem, is how people understood heaven. There's a really interesting book about heaven by Colleen McDaniel. It's called Heaven, a History, and it takes us through the understanding of heaven and how it changes throughout Christian history. Heaven was not always like a land of like fields and flowers and butterflies, like we imagine it now. Heaven was a place of that was profoundly differently understood in the Middle Ages, and Jerusalem was the model for it. Heaven was a city, a holy city. And so that's important for Christians. For Jews, obviously Jerusalem is important. It's the last remaining remnant of the Second Temple, the Western Wall. This is where Judaism's central identity is formed, where the temple was destroyed in the year 70, where Jews still can go to at least be close to that place where God once was able to dwell in the Holy of Holies. So Jerusalem is extraordinarily important for Jews. For Muslims, Jerusalem is the site of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad's ascension into heaven. The Dome of the Rock is a mosque built on the Temple Mount, right? So we've got a mosque on the temple in this site where Jesus was crucified, and all of this is like overlapping in the same space. So in the middle of the 11th century, Muslims in and around Jerusalem, at least reports are that Muslims in and around Jerusalem began making life difficult for Christian pilgrims who wished to see the sites associated with Jesus and his followers. So if someone's in control of a sacred site, you can make it hard for the people who want to see it. You can charge more money, you can make threats, you can extort, and some of those things were happening. Between 1085 and 1095, some Christian pilgrims were killed by these Turkish Muslims who were in control of Jerusalem, and some Christian churches were destroyed during this time. Things are kind of heating up. There's flare-ups, there's religious violence, but I want you to know that, like, also for much of this time, people lived in harmony. Jerusalem was an extraordinarily cosmopolitan city. Much of the ancient world, or the medieval world, included harmonious interactions between Muslims, Jews, and Christians. It wasn't all-out warfare at all. And so we tend to imagine it that way. It was not. There were moments of violence and flare-ups, but there was also great examples, of course, of cooperation and living in harmony. But things had been heating up, and by 1095, the Byzantine emperor, right? So the Christian emperor in the East, Alexius, calls on Pope Urban, the leader of Christianity in the West, for help with what to do with the Muslims, and how to keep control of his empire and how to keep his empire Christian. He calls on the West for help. And so in 1095, the Council of Clermont is called and the Crusade is announced. And so that's how it all begins. So some of the ways of thinking about war were changed during this time. As far back as Augustine, a just war doctrine was established within Christianity that includes the idea that, and these are still the basis of just war theory today. So that war can never be an act of aggression. It can only be an act of defense. War must be waged by the proper authority. You can't just, decide to get together with anybody and just like start attacking your neighbors. War has to be announced by kings, presidents, Congress. It can't just be like willy-nilly, anyone decides to start a war. And according to Augustine, war must be done with love, that the enemy has unalienable human dignity. So you can't just slaughter people and treat them as if they are monsters or less than human, even if you're at war with them, perhaps especially if you're at war with them. And the enemy has unalienable human dignity, even in war, which should be undertaken only as a last resort and only as defense. The enemy has unalienable dignity, and reconciliation should be pursued as quickly as possible. That's just war theory. The Crusades were a holy war, not a just war, okay? Urban II understood the Muslims as the aggressors. And so that's common. Both sides feel that the other side is really the problem. That can happen in any conflict. But what Urban does and what the First Crusade does is expand the idea of war as a last resort. What Urban's call to crusade does is turn the idea of war itself into a glorious thing and a way of pleasing and honoring God. So the crusade wasn't just a defense of holy sites. Urban turned the crusade into something pleasing to God, some way to honor God. So just war transforms into holy war. And Pope Urban offered full remission of sin for all crusaders, plenary indulgence. Any sin that you have ever committed or any sin that you commit on the way will be forgiven. And so what did you think, what kinds of behaviors that leads to are going to be obvious. Most crusaders, and these were just your everyday person, would have understood themselves as having entered into a contract with God, that the fulfillment of the terms of which they would be rewarded for in paradise. So the Crusaders, all right, I'm going to try to share this map here. And oops. So here you can see the routes of the Crusaders to the Holy Land, right? Clermont is here. This is where the Council of Clermont is called by the Pope. Two groups of Crusaders leave from France, one from northern France and one from southern France. And one group starts in Cologne in northern Germany, okay? And what we're reading from the slaughter of the Rhineland Jews comes from this group, okay? So they are starting out and they head into the Rhineland, southern Germany, where there are communities of Jews. They hadn't even gone very far before the events that we read about take place. Oops. And then they would have traveled through present-day Hungary, Serbia, through the Byzantine Empire, and to Jerusalem, Constantinople, right? So this is a long walk. It's going to take 4 years. The other groups start and go a slightly different way through northern Italy, or all the way down through Italy and over the Adriatic Sea. Sorry. And then everybody converging in Constantinople and then down to Jerusalem. So you can see that. But that's that group that departed from northern Germany that we are reading about this week. So who were these people? Well, there were some leaders of the Crusades. Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, they took various routes. So these were leaders that were sort of commissioned by the Pope to lead the Crusades. But the people who joined them were just thousands of men and women, entire families. Like basically the Crusades would come to a town and the whole town, including the animals and the children and the women and everybody would just kind of pick up and start walking. Peasants, middle-class barons and lords, entire families. Few of them, if any, had any idea what they were doing or what they would be expected to do. They were encouraged. They were, in many cases, profoundly ignorant, violent, and encouraged by the ideas and guarantees of eternal reward. They were impressionable. They were theologically beyond ignorant, right? Illiterate. And we read about that with the goose in this. So this is basically the story. And so they make it to Jerusalem in 1099. And they take control of Jerusalem. And I'm going to just send you a short video that talks about that and what ended up happening. Jerusalem goes back to Muslim control within a century. So as you read Albert of Aix, I want, if we have time, to be able to talk about what happens, right? Just basic the facts of this account. What is Albert's attitude toward the events? What is his attitude toward the Crusaders? And then how do we feel about such a thing? I am a graduate of a high school in Wisconsin whose mascot is the Crusader. And that's still used as a mascot and as a term at some Christian schools, although many of them are changing. And so I find that to be sort of an issue of thinking about history. What does it mean to have this term crusader being used when we read accounts like this? And so anyway, there's a lot to digest there. I'm going to stop here, and I hope if you have questions, you can bring them to our session on Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you then.